I need to talk about Little Nightmares. You know, with the third game coming around the corner, releasing only in just a few days, I feel like I had to share my love and adoration for a series which I think still remains underappreciated and should be regarded as one of the greatest ever. You know, I would never classify it as, through both games 1 and 2, as the most scary I've ever played. And yet I think they still stand as the greatest the horror genre has ever had to offer. And although they're clear spiritual successors, you know, inspired by games like Inside and Limbo, which I think are phenomenal in their own right, I think the reason Little Nightmares and what Tarsier Studios produced, it almost is lightning in a bottle due to one simple reason in particular, which is how they absolutely nail the atmosphere. I can't think of a game which does it better than those two. You know, the incredible art direction is really the driver behind that. And Tarsier do such a phenomenal job of making you feel small in a world you're not meant to be in. You know, it's this perfect industrial horror. I don't even know how they come up with some of the concepts of these enemy designs. I think of like the teacher with her long winding neck into the hunter at the start of the second game as well, for example. And the countless other ones like the chefs in the first game. All these grotesque creatures which you have to avoid and you know, get past. That's really the core gameplay loop in itself. And, you know, and on the idea of atmosphere and loneliness, I think something that Little Nightmares does perfectly well is it draws, in a lot of ways, I always make the reference because it's one of my favorite series of all time and it is so influential for so many reasons, but Dark Souls. The way Dark Souls 1 in particular did storytelling was much more passive and more found in the smaller details. It wasn't put in your face as much as a lot of the other games of the time. And I think Little Nightmares adopts that philosophy and sort of takes it further. You know, as you get through the game and you go from point A to B and you see the world in the background decaying and sort of deforming around you, a lot of the ideas and concepts that are built within the art direction are kind of made for you to make your own interpretations of. And what you get is this sort of, in conclusion, is this incredible world. When I talked earlier about being in a place that doesn't want you there or you're not supposed to be in, I feel like that alien industrial horror is just amplified even further with even just the background elements, not including just the enemies, which I talked about before. It's everything put together. And I feel like something else I have to point out is that Little Nightmares, both games, are actually made on Unreal Engine 5. And, you know, a lot of people, when they hear that phrase or that sentence, a game being developed on that engine, which has built a lot of bad reputation over the last few years for being buggy, being one that performs poorly, full of stutters, lag, and everything in between. You know, a lot of AAA studios are using Unreal just to the wrong extent and has got a lot of player backlash as a result of that. Little Nightmares is almost in a lot of ways the complete antithesis. It's a perfectly sculpted game with nothing wasted, and you have to admit it runs phenomenally. It is a beautiful game to play and also to look at. I can't also think of a game or any other games that do or represent the idea of quality over quantity. You know, we're in an era now within modern gaming, which I think this, to be honest, stands for the last 5 to 10 years of a time period where people are so obsessed with how many hours they're going to get out of a game or how much they're paying for. You know, and I'm no shame. I've got no shame in admitting that I've fallen guilty to that to some extent. You know, I have hundreds, if not thousands of hours in games like Counter-Strike and Destiny 1 and 2, both of which I've talked about on this channel and have extreme love and adoration for. And yet, I feel like I've got so many, almost just as many memories with a game like Little Nightmares, with the first one alone with its runtime of only about 2.5 to 3 hours. And despite that short runtime, it left such a lasting impact on me that I'm here talking about it to you today. And I think that's a mark of what a good game is, one that leaves an imprint on you long after you finished with it, whether it's, you know, 100 hours or just one. You know, Little Nightmares definitely leans towards the latter. And there will always be people who argue that the price, you know, might be a little bit too steep for how many hours you get out of it. But as I said, the impact it leaves is worth far more than anything, you know, anything like that. And, you know, there's elements of it that stick with me so much outside of the art direction, the incredible atmosphere. I think what it is sometimes with games like that, which are so linear and so focused on just putting the player from A to B from start to finish, sometimes games like that can become a bit stale, become a bit frustrating because you don't have that player agency, right? I think Little Nightmares does so good in every other department that it makes up for that. And it works as a linear game, because there's examples in recent memory that I can think of. Something like Still Wakes the Deep, which a lot of people did like. I personally didn't love it as much because I felt a little bit restricted, and the rest of the gameplay loop and the art direction didn't make up for it as much for it to be worth my time. I still thought it was decent, but nothing compared to what Little Nightmares, which in a lot of ways has similar core tenets, was able to achieve. And I do have some worries for number 3. Not very many, but a couple, mainly due to the fact that Tarsier Studios aren't helming the project. In fact, they're not making it at all. They're actually working on a new IP called Reanimal, which, if you go watch the trailer, in fact, I'll have it on the screen just here. You can see purely from an art perspective, a lot of the elements from Little Nightmares 1 and 2, they're bringing straight over. So I'm very excited for that, and when it finally comes out. And it's actually Supermassive Games who are working on number 3, and also the addition of a multiplayer co-op setting, which is interesting because I feel like the sort of amplification of loneliness that Little Nightmares 1 and 2 to an extent were able to bring forth in the fact that it was a single player game worked really well thematically. I don't know if a co-op experience will translate just the same, but I'm going to play it through in that format, and I'm very curious to how it turns out. I cannot wait. It releases only in a few days. I hope you're excited as I am. Yeah, I stands tall as one of the greatest game series of all time, and still so underappreciated. Thank you so much for watching, listening to me ramble about Little Nightmares, other games that I love. I love horror games. I love every game, truly. Thank you so much for watching, listening to me ramble, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good one, people.